I want to speak a bit about Hitler. Hitler's image has changed over the years. Today, Hitler's attempted extermination of the Jewish race takes center stage. So it is easy to forget that he was just as methodical about killing off the Slavs, whom he also considered, like the Jews, inferior beings. And he was possibly even more efficient. He killed 27 million Russians, 16% of the population. He boasted that he planned to turn Russia and Poland into slave nations. The conflict, he announced, will be very different from the conflict in the West. And Poland was the only country outside the fatherland where death camps were constructed. To serve the dual purpose of finishing off Russians as well as Poles, 3 of the Polish death camps were built virtually on the Polish-Russian border. He instructed his generals to level Leningrad, to target key buildings such as the Hermitage. His directive was, quote, "It is intended to surround the city and then raze it to the ground. Requests to be allowed to surrender will be rejected. We have no interest in preserving any part of the population of that large city." Hitler's master plan called for the uprooting of the remaining Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians, and replacing them with Germans who would till Slav land with the latest agricultural machinery and produce bounteous harvests of food for the growing German nation. Given this mindset, it followed that all Russian soldiers taken prisoner were routinely brutalized, penned into open fields, sometimes starved to death if death by exposure hadn't killed enough of them. More than half of the Russian soldiers that were captured died. Another area of agreement Roosevelt and Stalin discovered at Tehran was that both believed it was simply a matter of time, no matter what post-war measures were taken, before Germany would again rise up and menace Europe. Stalin therefore sought from FDR an alliance that would stop or deal with their next attack. FDR knew this, and it dovetailed with his mindset. He kept emphasizing that the 4 powerful nations, the 4 policemen, who would later take form with the addition of France as the permanent members of the Security Council, would ride herd on the rest of the nations. At the Tehran conference, Roosevelt was housed in the Russian embassy. He assumed, by the way, that his rooms would be bugged. Stalin developed a habit of dropping by his rooms to make sure he was being well taken care of. Zoya Zarabina, who spoke English, remembered that she happened to see Stalin one morning when he was somewhere near FDR's suite, and obviously intent on visiting the president. She translated as Stalin asked, "May I come in?" Roosevelt said, "Welcome." The conversation began with Stalin's simple questions to Roosevelt. "How are you? Did you have a good sleep?" The president replied, "Yes, I had a good sleep. I like it here. However, the frogs kept croaking in the pond, and I could not fall asleep." I turned around, said Zarabina, and looked at Stalin, and in agitation, I forgot what was the Russian for a frog. I said, "Joseph Vissarionovich, those little yellow animals croaking in the pond did not let the President of the USA sleep." According to Zarabina, all the frogs were killed. Before the final plenary session at Tehran, FDR decided to approach Stalin as informally as Stalin had approached him. FDR felt he needed that intimacy to make Stalin accept his plans, which included an acceptance of power restraints. On the last full day at Tehran, he went about getting it in his own peculiar way. As Roosevelt later told Frances Perkins, his Secretary of Labor, by the way, the first woman in a cabinet position, he felt drastic measures were called for because otherwise what we were doing could have been done by the foreign ministers. His campaign to get personal with Stalin was done at Churchill's expense. As they entered the conference room, FDR recounted, I had just a moment to say to him, "Winston, I hope you won't be sore at me for what I'm going to do. Churchill's reaction had been to shift his cigar in his mouth and grunt. As soon as they were seated around the table, Roosevelt recounted to Perkins, I talked privately to Stalin. I didn't say anything that I hadn't said before, but it appeared quite chummy and confidential, enough so that the other Russians joined us to listen. Still, no smile from Stalin. Then I said, lifting my hand up to cover a whisper, which of course had to be interpreted, Winston is so cranky this morning, he got up on the wrong side of bed. A vague smile passed over Stalin's eyes, and I decided I was on the right track. I began to tease Churchill about his Britishness, about John Bull, about his cigars, about his habits. It began to register with Stalin. Winston got red and scowled, and the more he did so, the more Stalin smiled. Finally, Stalin broke out into a deep, hearty guffaw, and for the first time in 3 days, I saw light. I kept it up until Stalin was laughing with me. And then it was that I called him Uncle Joe. He would have thought me fresh the day before, but that day he laughed and came over and shook my hand. From that time on, our relations were personal.